Welcome back to the Psyche and Singularity series. I'm going over my book, Jungian Psychology and Holographic String Theory. So in this video, I will be going over the final chapter and the conclusion of the book, where I'll be talking about Jung and Pauli's theory of synchronicity and how that relates to Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory. So the book is divided into basically 4 chapters of evidence for Jung's theory, for the synthesis of Jung and Susskind. The first chapter was addressing Jung's Leap Day letter from February 29, 1952. He wrote a letter concluding the letter with Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. So he wrote the letter in the context of Einstein's general theory of relativity. So in that context, that equation can be translated as Psyche equals singularity. Highest intensity is infinite intensity of energy or mass, and smallest space is zero volume. That's a singularity, a point of infinite density. The next chapter was addressing the near-death experience that Jung and others had, but especially Carl Jung's near-death experience from 1944, where he felt himself. He said, and I'll read it again since it's such a key piece of the whole book. He said, "It seemed to me as if behind the horizon of the cosmos, a three-dimensional world had been artificially built up, in which each person sat by himself in a little box. I had been so glad to shed it all, and now it had come about that I, along with everyone else, would again be hung up in a box by a thread." So that is really the correlation that triggered this whole book, because it so closely matches Susskind's holographic string theory, according to which all of the information describing each cubic volume of three-dimensional space is superimposed at the horizon of the cosmos, where space-time is expanding away from our perspective on Earth at the speed of light. That speed of light stops space-time, so every point of the past, present, and future is interwoven at each point of the encompassing sphere, and it radiates back in with the echo of the Big Bang, the CMB radiation, cosmic microwave background radiation. It radiates back in on these elastic but incredibly thin strands of energy, the fundamental strings, to create this hologram of three-dimensional space. That's Susskind's theory. So you see how closely it matches Carl Jung's near-death experience. The next piece of evidence that we addressed was Carl Jung's Mandala theory, which he developed after analyzing more than 1,000 of Pauli's dreams that Wolfgang Pauli carefully documented, and Jung went through the dreams, analyzed them, and confirmed his theory that the ultimate archetype, from which all of the archetypes originate, the unus mundus, the archetype of the self, the God archetype, the one, it has many names, the archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. Jung's theory was that when a psyche is pulled by opposing demands, if the tension becomes intense enough, the archetype of the one will compensate the ego with mandala imagery, circles or spheres with a central point that creates chaos, order out of the chaos. So like a viewfinder, he said, the mandala, usually with divided into 4 segments, like a cross down the middle, centered on the middle point, that is the naturally emerging psychic image of the ultimate archetype of the self, or the unus mundus. So I said, well, if, according to Jung and Pauli, the laws of physics and psychology mirror each other because mind and matter both emerge from the unus mundus, then what is the physical correlate of the mandala image? And that is a black hole. It's a perfect, geometrically perfect sphere. Two-dimensional sphere with a mathematical point, the singularity in the center, and the universe is an inside-out black hole, expanding from a singularity instead of contracting into one. So that was another piece of evidence that, especially with Carl Jung, especially with Leonard Susskind and his partner Gerard de Hooft, they synthesized the long opposed languages of general relativity and quantum mechanics quantum mechanics in their model of a black hole, because the singularity is infinitely small, so you need quantum mechanics, and it's infinitely massive, has infinite gravity, so you need to bring in general relativity. They have to work together. They were ultimately synthesized, at least mathematically, in the holographic string theory version of information conservation at the event horizon of a black hole and the horizon of the cosmos. So that confirmed Jung and Pauli's theory that when opposites strain the psyche to the breaking point, mandalas will emerge to unite the opposites. That's exactly what happened with the union of quantum mechanics and general relativity in holographic string theory. We saw it earlier, the union of real and imaginary numbers in the unit circle, which becomes the Riemann sphere when it's extended to a point at infinity. And so that we went over in the previous video all the evidence of the mandalas emerging. So then the final piece of evidence is not string theory. The final piece of evidence is synchronicity, meaningful coincidences. So we've all experienced what seems to be meaningful coincidences, two physically unrelated events that occur close enough in time that it seems like they have a meaning. In the beginning of this series, the overview video, I talked about the classic example Jung mentions. One of his patients, a lady with an overly Cartesian attitude, René Descartes, said, rational souls are unextended in space and they think. Everything else is mechanical, it's material, it has no soul. So this lady was assuming she has no union with the cosmos, the natural world around her, this overly rationalistic Cartesian attitude. So she was telling Jung about a dream she had, and the dream involved a costly piece of jewelry shaped like a golden scarab, a beetle. While she was telling him the dream, he heard a buzzing on the screen outside of his window. He looked out, and it was a beetle, not a scarab, but something that looked similar to that in Switzerland, which was unusual at the time. He said it wasn't a kind of an insect he'd seen around there before. And he thought it was unusual that it was buzzing to get into a dark room from the light. Usually insects like to go to the light. So he opened the window, put the beetle cupped it in his hands, and presented her the beetle and said, here's your scarab. So that cured her of her idea that she was completely isolated as a rational human from the rest of the natural world. And that opened up the possibility for this healing and this union of the collective unconscious with the conscious mind. So at any rate, that's one example of a meaningful, apparently meaningful coincidences. What are the odds that she would be telling Jung her dream about a beetle, and then this beetle starts trying to get in, that, you know, it wasn't like some kind of an insect that he was used to seeing. I've had synchronicities in my life that seems to me even more precise and intense than that. I know a lot of people have. So the question is, how do these things occur? Where are synchronicities organized? They're not physical events, so you can't, there was no physical force that was drawing that beetle towards that window as the patient was telling her dream of the beetle, and yet it seems like they're connected meaningfully. So is there any place in the cosmos where these events, the meaningful perceiving minds and the physical events that symbolically represent meaning to the human mind, is there some connecting mechanism to account for those? So yes, the horizon of the cosmos fills that bill if we synthesize Susskind's string theory with Carl Jung's near-death experience, because mind is also merged with all of matter at the horizon of the cosmos. And that's the main idea that I address in the chapter on synchronicity in the book. So I will go through a little bit, read a few passages from here, and just to show that this isn't just kind of a little side thing that Jung was tinkering with. It's important to note that he roots his synchronicity theory in his relationship with Einstein and Pauli. So to bring string theory in makes sense because Einstein gave us general relativity, Pauli gave us quantum mechanics, Pauli and others. they're fused in string theory. So if both of those languages of physics provide insight to synchronicities, string theory should do so all the more so, as I'll explain. So I'll just read this letter. February 25th, 1953, so a year after the leap day letter of Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space, Jung writes a letter to Carl Selig, and he says, Professor Einstein was my guest on several occasions at dinner. These were very early days when Einstein was developing his first theory of relativity. So that was in, I believe it was 1909, and it was before Einstein developed general relativity in 1915. So continuing the letter, Jung says, it was Einstein who first started me off thinking about a possible relativity of time as well as space and their psychic conditionality. More than 30 years later, the stimulus led to my relation with the physicist Professor W. Pauli and to my thesis of psychic synchronicity. So it was actually Wolfgang Pauli who invited Jung to publish an article with Pauli. Pauli wrote an article about the influence of the collective unconscious archetypes on Kepler, and Jung wrote an article about synchronicity. And the theory of the title of the article is Synchronicity, an acausal connecting principle. So, acausal connecting principle. So there's no physical cause between meaningfully connected events. So they are acausal. And if they're acausal, Jung explains, they must be outside of space and time, because cause and effect, and this he relates to Immanuel Kant and how Kant dealt with David Hume. So David Hume, British empiricist, says if it's not rooted in some sense perception, one of my 5 sense organs, if I can't see it, smell it, hear it, touch it, or taste it, it's a figment of my imagination. I can't hear, see, or smell, touch, or taste space or time or causal links, the idea of cause and effect. I can see someone drop a ball and then I see it fall. I don't see anything causing it to fall. I don't see gravity. I just see this event, then that event. It's that continuous sequence of events that we call cause and effect. Hume said, but there's really no necessary connection. It's just that's the way it always has happened in the past. We assume it'll be that way in the future, but we can't be sure. So Kant said, oh, you've woken me from my dogmatic slumber, David Hume, but space-time and causality, the idea of cause and effect, they are not empirically observable, but neither are they imaginary fictions that humans create. They are the a priori categories of thought. They're inborn, pre-existing lenses of perception that are forced upon us at birth. So they are real things, they're just not empirically observable things. That was Immanuel Kant. So Jung, picking up from where Kant left off with his theory of the archetypes of the collective unconscious, he's saying synchronicity is a 4th a priori category. You've got space, time, causality, and then he says you should add synchronicity as the 4th. And this brings back his idea, which we discussed in the previous video, of the axiom of Maria, one of the archetypal ordering principles that crops up, especially for the alchemists, was this idea of from the 3 comes the 4 as the 1. So it's just from the 1 comes the 2, from the 2 comes the 3, from the 3 comes the 4 as the 1. And I showed how the unit circle, the imaginary number line, and the real number line demonstrate that. The 4-fold square rooting of -1 rotates in a circle. At any rate, Jung relates that also to this idea of adding synchronicity as another acausal, as an acausal connecting principle. You've got causality, and that describes events in the 3-dimensional world of mechanical ordering, and then you've got synchronicity, which is another category of thought, that we perceive meaningful coincidences. So, and again, the main point of all this is, well, where are these meaningful coincidences coordinated? How are they organized? It seems like when that lady was having her dream, and then she was telling Jung, and then the beetle had to be flying nearby, everything in space and time had to be perfectly orchestrated to come together just at that moment. Where could this orchestration occur? And I'm saying it occurs at the cosmic horizon, which is the collective unconscious mind. So the whole model of the psyche built on this synthesis of Jung and Susskind is each psyche is one with the archetypal psyche, which consists of a central point, the singularity, and an encompassing horizon. The central point is the conscious aspect of the psyche, and the horizon of the cosmos is the collective unconscious. And the union of the two is the self. So meaningful coincidences are orchestrated where all the past, the present, and the future of mental events and physical events are all interwoven, and they radiate in. So the fact that they're somehow connected meaningfully in our minds makes sense when we find that meaning and matter are merged at the horizon of the cosmos with our own, that is our collective unconscious mind. And so let me just read here a little bit more. So this led Jung and Pauli, after Jung suggested including synchronicity as a fourth a priori category of thought, he came up, and I'll just show you this diagram with Pauli. So up at the top there, they've got indestructible energy, at the bottom, space-time continuum, and then the constant connection through causality, constant connection through cause and effect, as it should be, and then inconstant connection through synchronicity. So indestructible energy, that would be information conservation at the horizon of the cosmos. Information is not destroyed. In the universe, it's conserved. This space-time continuum, that's the three-dimensional hologram, and then you've got cause and effect, and that's what predominates in the three-dimensional world. But at the horizon of the cosmos, what predominates is synchronicity, the simultaneous occurrence of the past, the present, and the future, which is experienced blissfully, according to Carl Jung's recollection of his near-death experience. And that's also related to his theory of the pleroma, which we discussed in previous videos. So with that in mind, this idea of meaningful coincidences being organized at the horizon of the cosmos, I discussed parallels between Alfred North Whitehead, the mathematician and philosopher. I compared what he calls the four phases, the four creative phases. He says, there are thus four creative phases in which the universe accomplishes its actuality, in his book, Process and Reality. So Whitehead, I knew his name before reading Process and Reality because of his famous quote about Plato, where he says, and this I mentioned in the conclusion of the book, he says, the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. So that always struck me. I think that's true. And then just to mention synchronicity, it was funny, yesterday, a professor of mine, Eric Weiss, sent out an email, oh, I heard some people were talking about Whitehead. If anyone wants some instruction on Whitehead, then you should, let me know. I had just been reading this chapter of the book about synchronicity, and this bit that I'm about to talk about Whitehead, on that same day. He was the one who I read Whitehead, the book, Process and Reality. It was his class that I took it in. I was preparing to give this video on that, and then he contacted. So that was an example of a synchronicity. What are the odds of all these years that have gone by? He puts out that email on the very day that I'm preparing this video on synchronicity. The chapter was about synchronicity, and there was a synchronicity about linking Whitehead and the concept of synchronicity. So, so originally I was thinking I might not mention this part in the video, but that synchronicity made me think that I should. So what I'm going to do is read a quote from Whitehead's Process and Reality, where he talks about God and his function as the kingdom of heaven. And it's very much like the holographic horizon of the cosmos that Susskind describes. So I'll read a quote from Whitehead, and then I'll translate it into its equivalent in Susskind's cosmology. So these four phases that the universe accomplishes its actuality, he says, there's first the phase of conceptual origination, deficient in actuality, but infinite in its adjustment of valuation. So I equate that with the singularity just before the Big Bang, infinite in its adjustment of valuation, but deficient in actuality. So all of the infinite possibilities of cosmic unfolding are contained in the singularity. So that's the first phase. Secondly, there is the temporal phase of physical origination with its multiplicity of actualities. That's the Big Bang. Thirdly, there is the phase of perfected actuality in which the many are one everlastingly without the qualification of any loss either of individual identity or of completeness of unity. In everlastingness, immediacy is reconciled with objective immortality. So that third phase is information conservation at the horizon of the cosmos. That is what Jung experienced during his near-death experience. So I'll read that again because I think the correlations are pretty clear. The thirdly is there is the phase of perfected actuality in which the many are one everlastingly without the qualification of any loss either of individual identity or of completeness of unity. In everlastingness, immediacy is reconciled with objective immortality. So again, that's a pretty good description of the way Jung described his merging with the past, the present, and the future at the horizon of the cosmos. So then, Whitehead says, in the fourth phase, the creative action completes itself, for the perfected actuality passes back into the temporal world and qualifies this world so that each temporal actuality includes it as an immediate fact of relevant experience. So, I mean, he's a mathematician. He's trying to be as detailed as he can be. So the fourth phase is the holographic projection on these fundamental threads to create the three-dimensional world. From the perfected actuality of the horizon of the cosmos, the creative action is complete. But each of the temporal events unfolding in three-dimensional space carries with it the imprint of having been perfectly interwoven with every other event at the horizon of the cosmos. And that gives an explanation for the origins of synchronicities. How can these archetypally similar events, it's more than just a coincidence. There's some ordering principle behind it. It's not a physical ordering principle. What is it? At the horizon of the cosmos, that's the collective unconscious mind where all the archetypes are interwoven. That is what Whitehead calls God and his function as the kingdom of heaven. We saw St. Augustine refer to the horizon of the cosmos as the mother of God and also God's house. It just provides a good cosmic ordering principle and mechanism to describe synchronicities. So I'll now continue here with Whitehead, where he summarizes these four phases in another paragraph. So he says, for the kingdom of heaven is with us today. So the kingdom of heaven, that's the horizon of the cosmos. The action of the fourth phase is the love of God for the world. It is the particular providence for particular occasions. What is done in the world is transformed into a reality in heaven, and the reality in heaven passes back into the world. By reason of this reciprocal relation, the love in the world passes into the love in heaven and floods back again into the world. In this sense, God is the great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands. So how is God a sufferer? Well, one of the ways to perceive that is the way Plato and the Hindus look at it, is the material universe is like a dream. So it's like God's dream. And if this is God's dream, this is also where God's repressing anxieties and fears. We are the expressions of God's repressions. But in the horizon of the cosmos, the kingdom of heaven, that's the conscious mind of God. We call it the collective unconscious, but that would be correlated to the conscious mind of God. And so that conscious mind compensates us here down in God's subconscious mind. That's one way to look at it from a Whiteheadian perspective. But I think the main point is that, as Whitehead just demonstrates in these four phases of universal creation, it provides a explanation for how synchronicities occur. So then another example of a world historical synchronicity, a civilization forming synchronicity, perhaps the most famous synchronicity of all, is St. Augustine's conversion experience in the Garden of Milan in 386 Common Era. So, as he describes in his Confessions, the Confessions of St. Augustine, he was combating his lusty, riotous desires of youth. He wanted to overcome them. He prayed to God, please, God, let me overcome my sins, just not yet. That was how he would pray. I want to be cured, but not quite yet. So eventually it got so bad, he didn't know what to do with himself. He was weeping bitterly. He threw himself under a fig tree in a garden in Milan, and then he heard a child uttering a phrase that he'd never heard children utter before. There was no game in which he'd heard, in America and in the 20th and 21st century, a game children play, at least in America, in the pools, is Marco Polo. One kid yells out Marco with his eyes closed or her eyes closed. The other kids say Polo, Marco Polo, and you try to find the other kids when your eyes are closed. Is there some game, Augustine thought to himself, when he heard the child say tolle lege, take and read, the kid kept saying. So he couldn't figure it out. So here's a quote from Augustine's Confessions. He said, damning the flood of my tears, I arose, interpreting the incident as quite certainly a divine command to open my book of Scripture and read the passage at which I should open. So he opened to St. Paul's epistles, Romans 13:13, chapter 13, verse 13, and this is what he read. Not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and impurities, not in contention and envy, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make not provision for the flesh in its concupiscences. So then Augustine said, after he read that, a light of utter confidence shone in my heart, and all the darkness of uncertainty vanished away. So, what are the odds that at his deepest rock bottom moment, a child would start to chant a little song, take and read, take and read. He would open the book and he would read something that seemed perfectly addressed to his exact situation. It seemed to him as if God had orchestrated all of these events, and that is what cured him, and a flood of certainty overwhelmed him from that synchronicity. So synchronicities, they generate psychic energy, so much so that in the case of St. Augustine, he was the main founder of the Western mind. He took Platonism, he fused it with Christianity. That's the medieval Western mind. For 1,000 years, the Western mind was more or less following the shape that Augustine stamped upon it, and it was a synchronicity that led him to do that. Richard Tarnas, the cultural historian who wrote The Passion of the Western Mind, he also wrote Cosmos and Psyche, which I'll be talking about in just a moment. He goes on to say that the birth of the Renaissance was related to Augustine's synchronicity because Petrarch was climbing Mount Ventoux in April 1336, and when he got to the top of the mountain, he pulled out a copy of St. Augustine's Confessions and opened it, and the description of the view of the water and the valley was almost exactly what Petrarch was perceiving, so that he too thought this was precisely orchestrated by God for me, just like Augustine thought was the case in his situation. So one synchronicity, which is Augustine's in the Garden of Milan, gave birth to the medieval mind, which was followed by the Renaissance, which was symbolically born with that synchronicity of Petrarch reading from St. Augustine's Confessions, in which Augustine had a similar synchronicity. So the point is, synchronicities have been major factors in the history of civilization, as I'll discuss even more in a moment. So with that, now we move into a special kind of synchronicity, astrological synchronicities. The meaningful coincidences between the planets in relation to Earth and events unfolding on Earth, the archetypally similar events. So in the conclusion of the book, which I'll be including in this video because the conclusion is pretty short, but I start that conclusion with a letter that Jung wrote to A.D. Cornell on February 9th, 1960. So he said about his synchronicity theory, what kind of evidence can I provide? Scientific evidence. He says basically 2 roads for further investigation exist. 1, experiment, and 2, the study of case material. So what kind of experiments can be done? He mentions astrological experiments. And what kind of case study? He mentions in particular the cases of death, severe illness, and serious accidents. So near-death experiences, that's one kind of evidence for synchronicity theory, he says himself, because there's this out-of-body experience and the uniting of mind and matter at the horizon of the cosmos. And then astrological experiments, they show synchronicities on a grand scale. That people, the idea of having a dream about a scarab beetle and then Jung noticing the beetle, he can tell us that story, but we haven't all experienced that firsthand. So if we don't believe them, we might be skeptical about the whole thing. Are there any kinds of synchronicities that occur on a scale that everybody can observe and judge for themselves? And Jung said yes. Astrology, astrological synchronicities, because we can all observe the positions of the planets, and then we can all observe our lives on Earth, and we can look back through history and see, are there any archetypal similarities between the archetypes of the planets and the events that are occurring on Earth? And in the book, I don't get into all the details of how to conduct astrological investigations. I just point to one book, Cosmos and Psyche, by Richard Tarnas, which I think he proved himself as one of the greatest scholars, living scholars today, with his book, Passion of the Western Mind. And he even said he needed to do that first. Then he wrote the book Cosmos and Psyche, which was about astrological synchronicities. He said, I know people wouldn't take this seriously if I hadn't proven that I'm a genuine scholar with this first book. So he goes back and very briefly starts the book by analyzing the astrological archetypes of the planets. For example, I think we all are familiar with Mars. Mars is the warrior god. Venus, the goddess of beauty. So those are the archetypal qualities associated with those 2 planets. And all of the other planets have their qualities associated with them as well. So the main point for the book is, if you read Cosmos and Psyche, it's a good place to begin. What you've got there is empirical evidence for synchronicities. And whether or not, how valuable astrology can be in your life, the main point that I'm looking at astrology for is just evidence for the synthesis of Jung's psychology and Susskind's cosmology. And the fact that synchronicities happen at all is evidence of this kind of a connecting mechanism. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of this chapter on synchronicity. And Jung says that he says, in Mysterium Conjunctionis, Jung says, if mandala symbolism is the psychological equivalent of the unus mundus, then synchronicity is its parapsychological equivalent. So mandala symbolism, mandala images emerge in the psyche from the unus mundus. And he's saying synchronicities are the parapsychological effects of the unus mundus. The unus mundus, I'm saying, is the singularity and the encompassing horizon of the cosmos. Mandala images emerge from the unus mundus. So do synchronicities. So if synchronicities occur, that, in Jung's mind, is evidence for the unus mundus, the singularity and the horizon, the mandala producing archetype of wholeness through the union of opposites. So is there evidence for synchronicities? I think everyone's experienced them in our own lives, but is there any kind of collectively available evidence that could be presented as scientific evidence for this theory? Yes, astrology, as out there and on the fringe of the intellectual world as it appears nowadays. Originally, it wasn't thought of that way at all, and some of the greatest scientists were astrologers, including Isaac Newton. But, if you're looking at the world from a Newtonian, ironically, from a Newtonian mechanistic cosmology, it doesn't make sense. Astrology doesn't make sense in that cosmology. So Isaac Newton was thinking of the universe not just as a machine, but that's the way his physics describes it. And that's the way the intellectual class has been interpreting the cosmos for the most part after Isaac Newton. So in that Cartesian mechanistic worldview, astrology doesn't seem to make sense. But when you look at the world from the perspective of Leonard Susskind's cosmology, especially when you synthesize it with Carl Jung's psychology, then astrology makes a lot of sense. Because all of the planets are merged with each of our individual biographies at the horizon of the cosmos. From the horizon of the cosmos, the threads are projected that create the planets, and the cosmic microwave background radiation is continuously streaming in from the horizon of the cosmos through that filtering lens of the constellations and the planets down to us to create Earth and the way things unfold in three-dimensional space. So the main point is our individual biographies, the entire history of Earth, are all interwoven with each of the planets in our solar system and all of the other galaxies in our universe at each point of the horizon. So there's connecting mechanisms there, and that's where all the archetypes of that is our collective unconscious mind, the horizon of the cosmos. So the entire world is a psychic projection, so that there should be meaningful coincidences between physically unrelated events. It becomes a lot less strange when you look at that through this very strange worldview connecting Susskind and Carl Jung. So I'll only read one example of an astrological alignment that's related to this attempt to synthesize Susskind and Jung, and that is from the conjunction of Uranus and Neptune in the early 1990s. So Uranus, the planet Uranus, astrologers interpret that planet to be the Prometheus of the planetary archetypes. So Prometheus stole fire from the gods of Mount Olympus and shared it with human beings, and then he was tortured for that rebellion. But the archetype related to the planet Uranus is therefore related to not only a rebel, a freedom fighter, but also science, astronomy, knowledge of the stars, and astrology. Neptune is associated with, well, Neptune's the god of the sea, but in addition, it's all formless potentialities, mysticism, the uniting nature of things, the imaginary world. And so when those two planets were united, according to astrological, the theory of archetypal astrology, you would see that conjunction of those two archetypes manifest in culture. And Richard Tarnas points out especially string theory, and that's holographic string theory emerged. Susskind and Tahouf developed their response to Stephen Hawking in the early 1990s. I believe 1993 they had it formulated. So here I'll read from Tarnas's book, Cosmos and Psyche. He says, in the early 1990s, many characteristic Uranus-Neptune themes were evident in the sciences during these same years. The rise of theories of hyperspace, alternative realities, virtual particles, invisible dark matter and dark energy, and multidimensional string theory all suggest this archetypal gestalt. Similarly reflective of the Uranus-Neptune complex is the increasingly popular multiverse theory, with our universe seen as but one of countless other universes existing in other dimensions, with new self-reproducing inflationary universes being endlessly produced out of black holes and big bangs like bubbles out of an infinite sea of bubbles. So here we see the spontaneous rise in the scientific mind of Neptunian metaphors and qualities, which are sea, bubbles, infinity, invisible dimensions of reality, unfettered speculative imagination, combined with Uranian themes, astronomical science, surprising new realities, ceaseless cosmic creativity, and new beginnings. So, when I'm synthesizing Jung and Susskind, the point I make in the book repeatedly is that Jung's psychology is presenting Susskind string theory with what it needs the most, which is empirical verification. You can't see these little threads, they're too small. You would need an accelerator the size of the galaxy and 1 million barrels of oil a second to fuel it to see things down at that tiniest Planck length level. So, is it science? Can string theory ever be considered a science if it can't be empirically verified? Well, I'm saying it can be empirically verified if you include in your idea of empirical science some of the farther out reaches, such as near-death experiences and synchronicities and the Mandala images that emerge to unite opposing principles in the human mind throughout history. If you include all of those as empirical evidence, they all support Suskind's string theory, which is ironic because Susskind presents his theory as this ultimate antidote to the illusion of intelligent design. Susskind doesn't believe in a soul or God or any kind of a meaningful ordering principle in the universe, and yet his cosmology and Susskind and Jung's psychology, they're like a broken locket. You know, you break a locket in half and then the two pieces fit together perfectly. That's what it seems like. And I don't think that is just a coincidence. And so with that, now I'm moving into the conclusion of the book, where I go back to Plato's Republic. So the entire academic tradition began with Plato's Academia in an olive grove in a park north of Athens called Academia. That's where Plato opened his first school and set up the mathematical curriculum in his Republic, his dialogue, The Republic. He said, here's how you should train people to open the eye of the soul to see the idea of the good, which I equate with the unus mundus, the archetype of the self. First, you start with just addition and subtraction. So like numbers on a timeline, one-dimensional, 1 + 2, -1. Then plane geometry, 2-dimensional. Then solid geometry, 3-dimensional. Then you study time as it presents itself in the periodic movement of solids, specifically the orbits of the planets and the vibrations of strings. So music and astronomy are the final capstone of the mathematical curriculum for the ideal students in Plato's ideal society of the Republic. So we see that in string theory, that astronomy and music are combined because astronomy is reduced to these fundamental threads which vibrate, and the way that they vibrate around the compactified dimensions of space. At each point of 3-dimensional space, there's 6 other dimensions twisted into these non-Euclidean geometrical shapes, Calabi-Yau manifolds. The strings wrap around them, and the way they vibrate, that creates all the fundamental particles. So we see all of the elements in the original academic curriculum for the ideal society. We see that in a fusion of Suskind's string theory and Carl Jung's psychology. And also the near-death experience. So the Republic ends with the myth of a soldier named Er. He wakes up on his own funeral pyre before it's lit, and he recalls his near-death experience, where he said he went to the outermost regions of the cosmos with a bunch of other souls. Lots were thrown down before them. They picked up their number, and then whatever number you got determined who got to choose from the lifetimes that were thrown, the different life choices you could make. What are you going to be in your next life? Oh, I got number 1. Okay, you choose first. Whatever habits you developed in your previous life would force you to choose a particular kind of a life. And so watches all of this occur, and then he saw after everybody chose their particular life, and didn't choose any because he was going to be sent back to his own body. They were then sent to the outermost horizon. So there's 3 sisters. So here's how Plato describes the cosmos in the Republic as an upside-down umbrella, or like a series of concentric bowls nested in each other. And the bowls represent the orbits of the planets with Earth in the middle. So the moon and the sun and Mars, Venus, the visible planets out to Saturn, and then the sphere of fixed stars, the constellations. That's the outermost sphere in the Republic. And then 3 sisters, the Fates, spin these bowls around as they sing. Clotho, Atropos, and Lachesis. Those are the 3 fates, and they represent the past, the present, and the future. And also on the rim of each of these concentric bowls is a siren, a singing deity. And the 8 concentric bowls, each siren sings a separate note, creating an octave, and the fates are singing. So as the souls, each soul, after it's chosen its life, it gets a thread of destiny. And that thread is woven first into the outermost sphere of the fixed stars by Clotho. And then Atropos weaves the thread into each of the planetary orbits centered on the Earth. And now its fate is fixed. So you've got the near-death experience, you've got the strings, the singing of the fates and the sirens imply that the information of each soul of its next life is encoded on the threads, on these strings, these threads of destiny, by the sound vibration. Why else would they be singing? And then you've got, so that's and it's a mandala. So you've got the spherical universe. In the Republic, the universe is a hemisphere. It's a sphere cut in half, so you can see the concentric spheres. But in the Timaeus, it was just a full-blown sphere with the soul in the central point that encompasses the outer horizon, which Plato depicted Timaeus describing as the mother substance that partakes of the intelligible. In the Republic, it seems like Plato's describing it, or having Socrates describe the universe as a hemisphere, just so you can see the interior structure. But it's good to think of it as just a sphere. And now you've got all of these ingredients that Jung said would be required to prove the existence of this archetype, the unus mundus, the near-death experience, the strings of string theory with the vibration of the songs of the sirens and the fates, and the archetypes of the planets, so archetypal, planetary, astrological synchronicity. They're all contained there in Plato's Republic. I'll read from at least this astrological interpretation of the Republic. It comes from one scholar, Robin Waterfield, in his translation of the Mythoverse. So I'll just read his translation and then read his commentary on it. So, after all the souls, influenced by the habits of their past lives, had chosen their next lives, the daemon, translated as deity, a kind of guardian angel, associated with each life, led its respective soul first to the outermost sphere of the cosmos, to Clotho, to pass under her hand and under the revolving orbit of the spindle, and so to ratify the destiny the soul had chosen in the lottery. Then the deity led the soul to Atropos and her spinning to make the web woven by Clotho fixed and unalterable. So Robin Waterfield, in his translation, here's what he says. He says, there are clear astrological connotations to the passage. The word translated destiny, so that's the threads of destiny, also means, or came to mean, degree on the zodiacal circle. Ratify is cognate with the rulership of a planet. In short, as well as setting an individual's destiny in a more abstract sense, the fates do so according to the positions of the planets, Atropos, and the zodiacal signs, Clotho. So that combines all of the elements that I've been putting together with Susskind and Jung. We see them already presaged in Plato's Republic. I don't think it's just a coincidence that at the end of that academic history, the cosmology that's reemerging is very similar to the one from which it originated. It seems not to be a random coincidence, but a meaningful coincidence, because it's like Plato's Republic is the DNA of the Western mind, and once that Western mind is completely unfolded from its origins, we see it resembling the father of the Western mind's cosmology, Plato. So, and that's also the kind of evidence Jung said we should look for. If a worldview is truly rooted in an eternal archetype, you'll find historical precedents for it in the past. We find precise historical precedents, not only in Plato's Republic, but in the Vedanta cosmology, and in so many other philosophers that we've looked at throughout the series. So this now is wrapping up the Psyche and Singularity series. I hope these videos have helped explain the ideas in my book a little more, and I think that this equation of the psyche with the singularity and the horizon of the cosmos is a real thing. I think that's what each of us is, and I think the implications are important for each of us individually, just to have self-knowledge, know thyself, like Socrates said, but also for society at large. We've reached a kind of a perilous point in world history, and I think that this emergence of the synthesis of Jung and Susskind's cosmology and psychologies I don't think it's accidental. I think it is emerging when it's needed. And I will, in the next series I'll be making, I'm going to talk about how to apply this knowledge of the equation of the psyche and the singularity to the world of politics, which is something I didn't do in the book, but that will be for the next series. So thank you for those who have watched these one or more of these Psyche and Singularity videos, and I will be back with some new ideas and a new series.